storm comes out, people find the ground.
This week's episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, so as you can see from the title page, this week's episode of the show is an American whiskey episode, and why not? I do enjoy an American whiskey, or bourbon, or rye, or whatever, single malt as the case may be. And some of the samples I've had sat around for quite a while, as to be said. I mean, it's like everything. Doing just one episode of the show a week, I have a bit of a backlog of stuff, and no matter how hard it is to try and get stuff tasted and do an up-to-date, relevant episode of the show. Well, not that the episodes of the show are irrelevant, but you know what I mean. So sometimes these samples kind of sit around for a little while, and this is a kind of case in point. But obviously, before we start, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone that's commented and retweeted last week's episode of the show, and especially a big thank you to Diplomatico for doing so. Interestingly enough, neither of the other two suppliers actually did, and I can't say I'm surprised that the Real McCoy didn't retweet my episode, considering what I had to say about them. But anyway, so today's little lineup is quite interesting. Again, a thank you to Marussia Beverages for the samples, and to Atom Brands for the two Balcones samples, although they didn't technically send me those per se. They were part of the American Whiskey Advent Calendar they sent me before Christmas to review, which I sort of did. I did a tweet and what have you, but you know, I didn't really use any of the samples in episodes of the show. But I thought, yeah, time to revisit Balcones, because it's been a number of years since I've had a look at those. So yeah, so basically I think I've included Balcones before, but very briefly, Balcones were one of the earlier craft American distillers, appearing in 2008, and I remember tasting their first releases, certainly of the Baby Blue Corn, which I'll be looking at obviously today as well, and they obviously again fell into the same trap that I probably spoke about the other week, of distilleries basically going, right, 3 years old, let's get our product out there, and there was a bit fainty and a bit sort of, you know, and it wasn't exactly a cheap bottling back then. I don't know what they go for these days, and it was never. You know, there were some nice bottlings. I mean, the malt again, which I'll be looking at today, was okay. Again, it had a tendency to be a little bit too young, and did seem to vary from batch to batch. And but you know, obviously we shall see. Obviously, as you well know, they moved to larger premises in 2011 when they bought the Tocas Fireproof Storage Company in Waco, in Texas, and shifted all their barrels over there, and then decided they were going to build a new distillery there, which they did in 2014, and that finally came online in 2016. And also, you probably may remember the slightly bitter battle between Chip Tate, who founded the distillery, and some of the other shareholders, which ended up in his leaving the company or being kicked out, whichever way you wish to look at it. And I suppose this is always the problem when you start up a distillery, and you have to bring in shareholders and what have you. Most of the time these things tend to sort of work out quite nicely. You all have a vision for your distillery, but obviously relationships change, as we all know, and hence why people like the Teeling family sort of sold Cooley and opened their own distillery, and the same with what's his face in I don't know what's his face. His name's just completely gone out. Mark Rainier in Waterford, selling out at Bruichladdich and sort of, you know. So obviously everything he does now, and the same with you know, the Teeling family, everything they do is what they want to do. There's nobody else to be beholden to, should we say. So anyway, so that's the first of the distilleries we're going to look at. The second, we're going to be looking at a couple of bottlings from Heaven Hill. Now, The interesting thing is we're looking at the new bottling of Elijah Craig. Now, Elijah Craig was a wonderful bourbon, bottled at 12 years old, and like a lot of distilleries around the world, they obviously have issues with preserving stock. I mean, although they're not exactly a small distillery, although I don't know whether they're still suffering a hangover from the fire in 1996. I mean, I imagine they're not by now, but even so, you know, losing, I forget how many thousands of barrels they lost, but it certainly was 5 figures, and it's still going to take you quite a while to sort of recover that, and that's going to leave you with a gap in your stocks. And of course, Heaven Hill, like I said, was founded in 1935 in Bardstown. Then fire sort of destroyed, I think it was about 5 warehouses. I was looking online at some of the footage, and it was a spectacular fire, if nothing else, it has to be said. And that's the problem with whiskey. If it catches fire, it's going up, and it's going up big time. But anyway, so in 1999 they purchased the Bernheim distillery from Diageo and moved their production to Louisville, although I believe they still age and bottle their whiskies in Bardstown. So yeah, so basically we're looking at the new Elijah Craig bottling. It has no age statement now. It's probably got younger spirit in it, I would imagine, and it's still reasonably priced in actual fact, which is quite unusual because in this day and age, as we well know, going to no age statement whiskies doesn't always necessarily entail a dropping of the price. In actual fact, you know, in more cases than not, it means the price is actually going up. You know, but anyway, we shall see if that's had a detrimental effect on that particular bottling, and we're going to be looking at one of their rye, the Pikesville 6-year-old. I think it's called the 101 proof or 110 or something like that. I forget now. But always been a real big favourite of mine, and certainly I know that gets big points in Mr. Murray's book, and it always seems to be ridiculously difficult to get hold of these days. But you know, it's always been a big favourite of mine, and it's nice to know that that's pretty much stayed much the same as it always had done. And finally, we're going to be looking at a new distillery, to me anyway, the Willett distillery, which is based in Bardstown, and it's quite an interesting sort of tale. It was founded in 1936, and like a lot of these distilleries, they have several different ranges, and so in the 40s they introduced the old Bardstown bottling, in the 60s the Johnny Drum range, in the 90s the small batch range was, or the small batch collection, which included Noah's Mill, Rowan's Creek, which we're going to be looking at today, and the Kentucky Vintage. It wasn't until 2008 when they started bottling their family estate bourbons and rye, and we're going to be looking at the 3-year-old. Now, the distillery at some point stopped production. I don't know when. I know it restarted production in 2012 when they installed a new pot still, but their website is a little bit vague on this point, so I don't know when production actually stopped, but it does seem that they've been releasing stuff even though they were no longer in production. Obviously they had stocks, so it wasn't until 2015 when they released their first estate bottled rye, or Family Reserve Rye, or whatever it's called. It seems to be called several different things, and it was released as a 2-year-old, and we're going to be looking at the subsequent bottling, the 3-year-old. And one of the interesting things about it is, having tasted it, it's very un-American in style, and that's because the first distillation takes place in a column still, and then the second distillation takes place in a pot still, which is quite unusual, I think. Although not unusual with regards to sort of, you know, I mean, obviously Canadian ryes are produced in column still, in hybrid sort of pot column stills and things like that, as we knew from last week's episode of the show with the batch kettle still that Diplomatico uses. And the interesting thing about the Family Reserve Rye is that it's a blend of high rye content rye and low rye content rye, so that their high rye mash bill is 74% rye, 11% corn and 15% malt. The low rye mash bill is 51% rye, 34% corn and 15% malted barley. So it's quite interesting why they put the two together rather than making a medium level malted rye mash. But then of course obviously they make a number of different bottlings, so obviously they're going to have different content. Certainly the Noah's Mill, from memory, tends to be sort of, or certainly comes across like a high rye mash bill, whereas the Rowan's Creek always seems to be more corn dominated. So we shall find out when we get there. So that's a little bit of a rundown on the distilleries we're looking at. So let's take a look at this afternoon's wine. Right, okay, so as often the case when I've got a number of different styles and ABVs and what have you, it's always difficult to figure out where to kind of start and finish the tasting. And normally, as you well know, I tend to sort of work low to high ABVs, but didn't think that was quite going to work today, so I've kind of loosely grouped them together, and I'm kind of almost, I suppose, doing it in flavour progression, I suppose. So we're going to kick off with the Balcones Baby Blue Corn, which is obviously, as the name suggests, a corn whisky made from blue corn. It's bottled at 46%, and it's going to be interesting to see whether they've kind of followed the way that, say, like the Welsh distillery, the Penderyn distillery, did with their Madeira finish, and instead of using more mature spirit, they basically tend to sort of keep the spirit pretty much the same age, so the bottling remains fairly constant. So it'll be interesting to see if this is pretty much young 3-year-old corn spirit, I suppose, or whether it has actually gained a bit more maturity over the years, but we shall see. The second bottling we'll be looking at is the Texas Single Malt. This is bottled at 53%, and again it'll be interesting to see whether that is actually sort of including any more mature spirit, or whether it's being kept at that sort of same sort of style. The third bottling we'll be looking at is the Rowan's Creek. This is bottled at 50.0%. Now, although it's never carried an age statement, it was certainly, when I first started in the industry, it was believed to be a 12-year-old bourbon. It's certainly a straight bourbon, so therefore that would indicate that it's at least 4 years old. But I think over the years the age of the spirit itself has been creeping steadily south, but the price tag has been creeping steadily north. So and I've often found it to be, out of the Rowan's Creek and the Noah's Mill, I found it to be the more variable in characteristic, being fairly heavily influenced by the corn, or what I believe is fairly heavily influenced by the corn. The rye content seems to have varied from year to year, on batch to batch. I mean, this particular batch is 1764, so I'm guessing it's the 64th batch of 2017. I'm guessing, but it is the currently available bottling. And although Rowan's Creek may or may not have existed as a distillery, I assume it probably did. It's actually quite interesting because it says bottled by the Rowan's Creek Distillery, and there is no Rowan's Creek Distillery. We know it's bottled by Willet, and this is one of the sort of like the interesting vagaries of American whiskey. You know, just because you own the rights to the mash bill, or you used to own the distillery at one point or time, or whatever, yeah, you can stick that on the label. You know, and theoretically, if the distillery doesn't exist anymore, how could you say it was bottled by that distillery? But that's picking scabs, or whatever you call it. Then we're going to move on. We're going to look at the new bottling of Elijah Craig. This is now a small batch, no longer an age statement bottling, and bottled at 47%. So, like I said, it's not going to be 12-year-old spirit in there anymore. It will be a lot younger. The question is, does it still have the intensity of the old 12-year-old Elijah Craig? That's what we're looking for, because the price hasn't really gone up that much. Then we're going to be looking at the 3-year-old Family Reserve Rye from Willet, Straight Rye. So again, it can't be a straight rye actually, because if it's only 3 years old, I think straight ryes have to be at least 4. But anyway, again, splitting hairs, I think it's just that it's been written as a straight rye. So anyway, this is bottled at 53.7%, and like I said, it's initially distilled in a column still, and then second distillation takes place in a pot still, so should be quite interesting. And finally, we're going to be looking at the Pikesville Rye. This is another straight rye whiskey, and I know this is 6 years old and is bottled at 55%. So, like I said, I've always been a big fan of the Pikesville. So even when it used to come in that sort of tall, classic shaped bottle with a horrible white label. I mean, it looked really cheap and nasty, but at least nowadays they put it in a slightly more interesting packaging, shall we say, which is probably a good thing. But anyway, there you have it. So that's today's little lineup. Shall we kick off with a bit of Balcones? Okay, so baby blue corn. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? It's not really changed very much at all. It's quite young. There's a little sort of spiritiness to it. There's a touch of sort of roasted corn, toasted oak, but it really is pretty young, and I'd have loved to have seen this with maybe a couple more years aging, because it really is quite an almost fainty spirit. And I just, to me, it's just, you know, some people love that edginess, and I don't mind the edginess, but it just seems to sort of, the trouble is when you smell a whiskey like that, it's very difficult to kind of look past that kind of spirit character. There's a little bit of toasty oak, touch of sort of almost kind of coffee kind of notes. I mean, it would just be interesting to see this with a bit more age and a bit less rawness, shall we say. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Nice sweet finish, it has to be said. Very corny, lots and lots of corn, but it doesn't have that sort of fat corn kind of character. It's got an edgy, oily, earthy kind of corn character, and it's relatively simple. It's often the case with corn whiskies, and nice spiciness, like I said, pleasant sweetness on the finish. It's still got that young edge, which is, you know, there. Little bit of oak, not a huge amount, sort of, you know, a little bit of that sort of toastiness kind of coming through on the finish, and it's just one of those sort of whiskies that I would just like to see a little bit more age. I would like to see less of the sort of slightly fainty sort of rawness, and a little bit more of the character of the spirit minus the raw bits, if you see what I mean. And although I don't think it's a bad whiskey at all, like I said, I would love to have seen that with just a little bit more age. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Texas single malt. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Yeah, that's nice. It's deep, it's malty, it's smoky. It's got some lovely sort of treacly kind of notes. I mean, looking at the colour of that, I mean, that's really picked up the oak kind of big time, and you're getting a lot of vanilla. It's young, but it's not as young or as fainty as the blue corn, and it really has some weight and some body to it. And I like the relatively youthful nature of this. It does seem to kind of work, and it certainly balances up all that kind of treacly, rich kind of character that it has. There's a little bit of almost kind of floral notes, sort of almost hyacinthy, sort of violety kind of notes. A little bit of ground coffee. Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's a nice nose. A lot more harmonious, I think. Let's see what the palate's like. Rich, full, coffee malt, treacle, dark chocolate, touch of spice, a little bit short as the alcohol kicks in, but it does kind of really balance up the sweetness, which is nice, and it kind of clears the palate nicely and allows the sort of spices to come through on the finish. A little bit of pepper and cinnamon, but it's full, robust but youthful, and yeah, I quite like that. I think that's to me, it appeals to me more than the blue corn does. But obviously we're all different, and I'd obviously urge you to make your own mind up about it. But yeah, I think that's pretty good. Right. Okay, so let's move on to the Rowan's Creek. Like I said, bottled at 50.05%. See what let's give us. That ain't 12 years old anymore. If it is, I'm a Chinaman. 5, maybe 6. Certainly no older than that. It's a lot of corn. There's an oiliness, there's a youthfulness, a touch of citrus. It's a bit of a sort of like, and we're talking a whiskey that's on the shelf for what, 70, 80 quid? I really don't think it's worth it anymore. Yes, it's got some nice citrus notes, it's got a bit of lime almost. I'm not getting a huge amount of oak. I'm not getting a huge amount of complexity. Like I said, it seems to me pretty much corn heavy. There's not a great deal of rye. There might be a little bit of spice possibly. But it's, from what it has been in the past, shall we say, this to me is quite a disappointment. And like I said, if you're shelling out sort of 70, 80 odd quid, you don't want to be disappointed, do you? Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Oh, that's bitter. Bitter caramel, bitter oak. I'm not getting a particularly sweet corn character. I mean, it's young, gristy, oily corn. It's fainty. It's bloody hard work, it has to be said. I mean, yeah, like I said, if this is 6 years old, I mean, that's about as old as I think it's going to get. I mean, it's obviously older than 4, but not by a great deal, it has to be said. And one feels cheated to a certain extent. You know, I mean, like I said, it never carried an age statement. It never had an age statement, so it was always, I don't know, it just seemed to be presumed to be 12 years old, like the Noah's Mill was always presumed to be a 15-year-old. And obviously nowadays that's not the case whatsoever. And this certainly is not a 12-year-old, and it's certainly not got the complexity and interest that it used to once have. It's short, it's a bit vapid, it's hard work, and you know, you're gonna have to pay an arm and a leg for it. You know, just sort of like, no, not at all. I'm afraid that's a big miss as far as I'm concerned. Not great. Okay, So let's move on to the first of the two Heaven Hill bottlings. So this is the Elijah Craig, which now, as we know, has no age statement. So let's see what the nose gives us. Fresh, crisper than I remember the older bottling. It's got some lovely toffee notes, touch of corn, sort of lovely, intense, spicy, dusty, almost chocolatey rye. Yeah, I like this. It's not lost its intensity. You can argue that it's lost a little bit of maturity, but you know, this is still a whiskey I would quite happily recommend, quite happily. And I suppose this was the biggest issue I had with this particular bottling, was has it lost its intensity? Because Elijah Craig was always a lovely high rye content, or should we say came across as a high rye content bourbon with loads and loads of intensity, and this certainly still has the intensity, which is really good. It's just a little bit younger, but it's not too young. I mean, I'm certainly not getting any faintiness, I'm not getting any sort of young spirit notes. It's just really quite nicely balanced. A bit of caramel coming through now, a bit of toasted oak as well. Sort of toasted corn as well. It's still got enough complexity, I think, to warrant its price tag. I mean, I think it's gone up from sort of something like slightly under the 40 quid now to about mid 40s, which is a bit of a hike, it has to be said, but I don't think it's too much of a hike, shall we say. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Yep, still relatively intense. It's a little bit more laid back now. Certainly opens with the corn and the toasted oak, sweet-ish corn, and the rye really sort of only kind of comes through on the mid palate and the finish, and it's got that slightly herbal, herbally spiced kind of character. Still really intense. Maybe you can argue it's a little less complex, but I still think it delivers a sort of a lovely mouthful of whiskey at the end of the day, and it has a lovely progression. That's one of the things I always look for in a whiskey. I don't want it all to basically just say, give me everything right from the word go and then just sort of like meander along. I like layering, I like sort of progression, I like to sort of taste sort of, you know, different flavours coming out, that kind of thing, and this certainly sort of does that. And I like it. I think it's still really, really good, and maybe one of these days the age statements will return. I mean, they're probably hanging on to them so they can sort of release the really old stuff like they used to. I mean, what they used to do, 18-year-old, 20-something odd year old, 28 was it, I think. Mind-blowing that they'd got stocks going back, or shall we say the availability of stocks going back that time, but then obviously it's Heaven Hill for you, isn't it? And yeah, I like that. I think that they've done a nice job of not, you know, stripping the intensity out of the Elijah Craig. So yeah, good stuff. Right, okay, let's move on to the Willett Family Reserve. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Very, very different. I mean, I remember the first time I tasted this, it was like, whoa, what the hell is this, you know? I hadn't actually sort of looked into the production process or what have you. I just tasted the sample and I was going, this isn't an American rye. This has more in common with a European rye, in actual fact. It has that sort of lovely high-toned dried fruit kind of character. A little bit of violet, touch of sweet rose petal. I mean, it is very young, it is 3 years old, but it's not marry. It's a sort of almost Auchentoshan-y like kind of rose petal kind of character. Little bit of spice, lovely vibrancy. I mean, that's one of the sort of key parts of this particular whisky. It has a real lightness and an elegance and a vibrancy, which you often don't find with American whiskies. I mean, it's certainly not got the weight and the chunkiness of other ryes, and I think this is one of its unique sort of selling points, personally. I mean, again, this is not cheap. I mean, you know, this is what, 70, 80 odd quid for a 3-year-old rye. It's like, that's ridiculous, really, when you think about it. But I remember showing this at a tasting a few months ago, 4th of July in actual fact, and I thought this might be one of those sort of whiskies that, you know, people might not warm to because it is so different from sort of bourbons and ryes that they're kind of used to. But it went down an absolute storm. I mean, people loved it, and I think that they loved it because it's a little bit different. Yeah, and it's all well contained. Like I said, it's very young. There is the rose petally kind of character, but it's not fainty, and it's certainly, I guess, probably more down to sort of like the, I don't know whether the initial distillation column still, you know, means that the spirit that's going into the pot still is obviously lighter and less full of impurities. I imagine that's probably what it kind of boils down to, which means that you can get away with bottling it a bit younger. So anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Chewy but light, again, dried fruit, high tone dried fruit, touch of chocolate, coffee, a little bitterness from the tannins, but again it's all kind of quite nicely balanced and weighted. Touch of rose petal on the finish. There is a little bit more of a Mari kind of character now. It is kind of indicating its youthful nature, shall we say. But it's got a lovely length, some lovely spices, and tongue tingling. But there's a little bit of dried banana, possibly, yeah, a little bit of dried banana, apricot. I think it's got loads and loads of fruit, loads of character, really different, really interesting, and really nice. And finally, let's move on to the Pikesville Rye, bottled at 55%. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oh yeah, baby, that's my kind of rye. Dense, rich, really spicy, slightly violety, peppery, chocolate, cocoa powder, lovely maturity, lovely weight, but there's a citric note there as well. It's kind of really well balanced. There's a little bit of a herbal note kind of coming through, and it's just the complexity within those rye characters. It's a bit like the Octomore and the complexity of the peat and the different sort of peat characters. You certainly get that with this. You get the herbal rye, you get the spicy rye, lovely sort of like toasted oak, and it's got a real spiciness to it, and it just sort of like says, I'm a rye whiskey, you know, and it's like, whoa, yeah, damn, that's good. Let's see what the palate's like. Big, chewy, rich, lots of treacle, licorice, dark toffee, but wonderfully spiced. Loads and loads of slightly coffeed spice, a little herbal spice, tongue-tingling spice. I mean, whoa, my God, that's incredible. Lovely underpinning oak, a little bit of toastiness, but the oak just seems to be sort of like, you know, just kind of sat there, giving it some lovely structure without sort of, you know, swamping it in vanilla. Lovely pepperiness, sort of lovely sort of chocolatey, peppery kind of aftertaste, which is just right up my street, as I say. And oh, I can't talk now. That's what it does to you. Damn, that is just bloody good rye. That is really intense, and you know, if you can get hold of a bottle of that, and there never seems to be any of it about. I mean, it's just like, you know, where does it all go? You know, but oh, what a finish! Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. So, big thank you to both companies for the samples for today's episode of the show. And Balcones, yeah, I mean, I love the brimstone. I mean, you know, unfortunately I didn't have a sample of the brimstone. I just love the weirdness of the brimstone. But I mean, again, it seems to me that the brimstone was all about sort of loads and loads of burnt Texas scrub, and it just covers up the sort of the fact that it's actually only a 3-year-old spirit. And that, I think, is the big problem with the Baby Blue Corn. They've obviously decided they're going to keep it at the same kind of style, so it's going to be bottled at about sort of 3-4 years old, I guess, and it's a bit too young, it's a bit too fainty, and I would really have liked to see a little bit more age on that. The single malt, yeah, I kind of like that. I can live with that. Again, it's young, it's youthful, but it's got a little bit more weight, a little bit more depth. There's less of the sort of the rawness of the spirit character, and it just all feels a little bit more integrated and a little bit more interesting. The Rowan's Creek, it's just a big disappointment, and you know, this is, you know, I know sort of Helen, the rep for Eau-de-Vie, or Marissa Beverages, I've told her about this, so it's going to be, there's going to be no skin off their nose. That they know what I think about this particular bottling, and it's a real shame because you know, I've always liked Rowan's Creek, although, like I said, Rowan's Creek has had a tendency to be pretty variable over the years, it has to be said, but really, come on, get your bloody act together, just stop farting about, put some older spirit in there, and just make it more bloody enjoyable at the end of the day. On to the Elijah Craig. Yes, it's younger, but it hasn't seemed to have lost its intensity, and that was the key for me with regards to this bottling, and this was what I was particularly worried that it may well have lost that, but it certainly hasn't, and I think it's definitely worth the money. The Willet, I love it. I think it's great whiskey. What the 70 odd quid is for a 3-year-old rye whiskey is really sort of value for money, of course, is open to debate, but I think purely from tasting the product, it is just so different, interesting, and you know, will obviously change your view of American whiskies and what American whiskies can be, and I think that's definitely a good thing. And the Pikesville Rye, well, you know, hands down, that was going to be the best, or not necessarily the best, the most interesting whiskey of the lineup, I think, and certainly it didn't disappoint. And yeah, like I said, I think if you can sort of track down a bottle of that, then you won't be disappointed. But I'm guessing at the end of the day that ain't going to be cheap. But then again, as I proved in the 4th of July tasting, sometimes you just have to spend a little bit of money to get, you know, a really quality product. You know, it's not always the case, but you know, I think with American whiskey, probably more so than anything else, you get what you pay for. If you're going to pay 15-20 quid all you're going to get really is old number 7 and what Beam White Label, and frankly they're not really that great. So you're going to have to shell out the money for something, you know, something nice. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Not a lot else to say apart from good dramming, good afternoon, and I hope you tune into the next episode, whatever that's going to be. I don't know. Anyway, later.
Years again.